Have you ever wondered why most homes in the United States are framed out of wood instead out of metal? I mean, if you think about it, it's not like metal framing hasn't been done before. Commercial buildings are usually framed out of metal instead of wood. So, why do we do commercial that way, but we don't do residential that way? Well, one of the biggest reasons that rules why certain framing is done for certain projects is cost. That's usually the answer to most questions in the built environment. It's always regarding cost. Now, specifically, when we're talking about why we're framing out in metal in commercial buildings, that answer is pretty much cost as well. But to get a little bit more specific, is that we want to make sure that we're dealing with fire when it comes to commercial. Now, we care about fire when it comes to residential as well, but when it comes to the code is way more strict the more people inside of a building. So if you're talking about very big buildings that are highly flammable or have certain chemicals inside them, there's going to be a lot of people there. They really, really, really want to focus on making sure that people can get out and there's a way to safely uh, get these people out and put these fires out and hopefully not even allow these fires to start to begin with. So when you compare wood versus metal, metal tends to deal with fire much better. Now, you could certainly frame out commercial buildings, but you would have to spend way more money and way more resources getting it to be fireproof, right? It's gonna be more of a headache. It's just not a common thing that people do. Now, when we're talking about residential, it's just something that's been done for so long. It's the common practice is to frame them out of wood. You can certainly frame them out of metal, but wood framing is just the common thing to do. I mean, think about this. It's been done for so long that if you hire a contractor or you hire someone to build it, right? Chances are they're more comfortable, they have more practice working with wood framing. Now, let's talk about, beside that, a couple of other reasons why wood is better for residential framing. So, first off, if you buy a piece of wood, you buy dimensional lumber, 2x4s to do your framing, and you need to create a custom profile. Maybe you have vaulted ceilings in your house, or maybe the way that your roof sits at a specific portion and it meets your ceiling. You have very, very specific conditions that are only applicable to this one house. Chances are that you need to apply custom framing to that. And if you want to custom frame something, then the easiest way to do it on the field is out of wood. It's just easier to deal with wood. If you think about like a commercial project, for example, commercial projects are pretty much, for the most part, very cookie cutter. They don't require a lot of complicated detailing like when you talk about residential. Residential, for the most part, unless you're doing, these typical cookie cutter row house projects or townhouse developments, if you're doing something like single family, then you do have more typical detailing when it comes to the commercial or the cookie cutter stuff than when it comes to a single family residential. Therefore, when it comes time to build it, it's just easier to use wood because you can cut the wood the way that you need to do it. Also, I mentioned at the beginning of this video costs, it's just cheaper to use wood from the get-go. Now, I'm not talking about overall, I'm not talking about long term, I'm not talking about the cost of getting the trades to put the project together. I'm talking about just raw material. When we're talking about raw material, it's cheaper to buy lumber, dimensional lumber, than it is metal components. And that right there is the reason why people will usually go with wood. So we have the fact that it's just easier to use in the sense that you can cut it very easily with common tools that these builders have, that all these different trades have. It's easier to do things like if you need to cut a specific hole out or cut a specific portion out of it to run wiring and elements like that. It's just easier to do with tools. It's just common practice, guys. So that's the reason why. Now, when you compare something like thermal bridging between wood and metal, wood is just better at handling any sort of heat flow. If you look at a piece of 2x4, I think that the R value is around an R4, whereas a metal stud is somewhere around an R1. So think about that for a second. The higher the R value, the better it is at managing the heat, the more resistance it has. So if you want to think about this, it's actually very intuitive, because if you imagine holding a stick and burning the other end of the stick, your hand will be pretty safe for much longer than if you did the same with a piece of metal. And if you need more help, think about a cast iron pan. You heat up the pan. If the handle of that cast iron pan doesn't have any grip or any way to protect you from the metal, you will get burnt much faster than if you did the same thing with a piece of wood. So that right there shows you that there's more thermal bridging happening when you're talking about metal than when you're talking about wood. So when you're framing out a house, you frame it out of metal because it has a lower R value. That means you need to pay more attention to the insulation than you would in a wood framed home. That's not to say that a wood frame home, you can ignore the insulation. As a matter of fact, I want to take a quick second to talk about insulation and something for you guys to think about. The way that the code allows you to frame, they will tell you that walls, right? And it all goes by climate zone. So it depends what climate zone you are. The code requires a specific amount of insulation per wall, right? Let's just say that it requires an R13, right? R13. And you insulate the way that the code requires you to, or the minimum that is required, which is in between the studs, right? Something that I want you to think about is that thermal bridging. Just because it's an R13, what you're putting into the cavity, when you average it all out, you're getting much less than an R13, guys. And why does that happen? Well, because the studs are not framed. I heard one time someone describe this as like putting insulation between your ribs, right? If you were to put insulation between your ribs, that would not keep you warm. It would be much more effective to put on a sweater or a coat over you. That would make you feel much warmer. And the same applies to insulation. If you're putting insulation between your studs, that house is going to still feel cold, much colder than if you were to put insulation over the whole entire assembly, whether it's how they do the open cell or closed cell foam framing, right, where they cover the whole structure, or whether you have some sort of like rock wool insulation on the exterior or whatnot. So going back to our insulation, when you are insulating metal stud framing, you want to make sure that you pay more attention to that thermal bridging that's going to happen, because heat inside the house is going to want to escape, and vice versa. If it's colder inside your house, somewhere like here in South Florida, than it is in the outside, that heat is going to pretty rapidly get inside your house, make everything feel worse than it is. So, pretty much sounds like wood is an exceptional product. And I haven't even talked about how renewable wood is. If you think about wood, you can have a forest of trees that's ready to be taken down and turned into dimensional lumber in about 20 to 30 years. We can do that over and over and over. It's like an infinite product that we have. It's an amazing resource. It really is. Now, metal stud is also recyclable. Some people would argue that it's easier to recycle, right? And then there's a whole other topic about embodied energy. If you think about a tree, you still have to take it to a mill, and then you're applying different products on it to do certain things like not rot, right? Certain products, and those products, they damage the earth. And then metal has its own process. And so that's called embodied energy. It's like, yeah, one of them is clearly more natural, but to produce it, it might require more energy. So that's a whole other conversation that I'm not going to get into here. But we're just to compare the two once they're at the yard, not how it was transported or how it was manufactured. But right when it's at the yard, we have wood stud and we have metal stud. When we look at wood, we can all agree that it's a renewable resource that probably requires less work to get made than metal stud does, right? So it's a great, great, great product. But there are some setbacks to it. One of the biggest setbacks of wood is the water problem. When wood comes into contact with water, over time, it starts to rot. It starts to lose its structural integrity. It starts to get filled with mold. It starts to get us sick because of all the mold that is living off of it. When you compare that to metal stud framing, you don't have those problems. Steel doesn't rot. Steel doesn't get affected by water the same way that wood does. Wood rapidly deteriorates when compared to steel. So that right there is a big, big, big bonus that steel has, metal structures have over wood structures. So longevity, if you're thinking about lasting longer, it's probable that your steel framing is going to last longer. Not only that, but if you have a home that has typical dimensions or typical footprints, you can actually have these metal studs custom made so that there's less work being done on the field. There's more assembly done and less cutting and tinkering and putting things together. That saves a lot of time, which saves a lot of money. And that's why at the beginning of this video, I talked about how the raw material might be cheaper for wood, right? Wood might be cheaper when it comes to the raw material. But when it comes to the overall life of the project, there might be an argument for stud, right? For metal stud. So going back to the question, why is it that homes are made out of wood framing here in the United States more commonly than metal stud framing? Well, the answer is because wood is just readily available. It's something that is very easy to work with, and it's just cheaper. The initial cost, the upfront cost of wood framing is just so much cheaper than metal. You have to pay double or triple from the get-go. It's going to turn off a lot of people from using it. Also, people are just more comfortable working with wood framing. It's something that's been done for so long. We're just comfortable doing it. But that's not to say that metal framing doesn't have its perks and you can't do it. Yes, you have to pay attention to how you insulate it, but that should be something that you're paying attention to regardless. One of the biggest benefits, as I mentioned, is the fact that you are going to have an easier time having this building last longer if you're doing metal framing. Also, naturally, it just deals better with fire. So, can you build a house out of steel framing? Certainly. You certainly can. I've worked on projects that are single family, believe it or not, and have steel framing, but it's not common. But if you ask around the people that have done it, people have framed out their basements with steel studs. People that have done it, they seem to like it. There seems to be an initial, learning experience that is required. But after they get all the detailing done, they actually seem to prefer it. So if you guys have any other information on the difference, anything else that you think I missed in this video that I should have probably said, because in case you haven't noticed, I'm just going off the cuff here, guys. I'm going off the old noggin over here. I'm not writing anything down, just thinking about stuff and talking about it. If you feel like I missed anything, feel free to let me know down in the comments and we can expand on that, possibly with a new video. All right? But anyway, until next time, guys, peace out.